Centre for Folklore, Fairy Tales and Fancy public lecture. We're in an unfamiliar space tonight. That is all that I could get hold of, but I mean, I think it's comfortable enough. I'd like to introduce tonight, I practice this, Larisa Prokhorova, who is from the University of Kemerovo, and actually she is not only an academic working there, she is Dean of the Faculty of Romance and Germanic Philology. So, like Professor Tolkien, she knows her stuff. She's going to be talking this evening on visual images in literary fairy tales in and behind the text. Could we welcome, please, Larisa Prokhorova.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bill, for introducing me, and thank you all for having me here, because it's great that you have this society for folklore, fairy tale, and fantasy, which brings me to a group of people who can share and understand my interests. Because sometimes it happens when I'm asked about my academic interests, and I say that it's intertextuality in literary fairy tale by the British authors. I have this, in response, I have this kind of understanding smile because people think that fairy tale is not a serious genre at all, and that it's kids stuff and there is nothing to dig into very much. What I think is that literary fairy tale is a very rewarding genre, both for the authors and for the readers. Because to my mind, literary fairy tale may be compared to an iceberg, when you can see only a small top, which is entertaining content, which is funny character, which is the children's audience as a target reader. But the most of it is beneath the surface. And to me, a literary fairy tale is an open system that is free to intermix everything that was before it and is around it, not only the folk tales traditions, not only myth and legends and fables, but also the literary context of contemporaries and predecessors, and also other discourses, and in fact all the cultural heritage that is around and was before it. And I think that literary fairy tale is a unique form due to its dual nature, which is reflected actually in the etymology of the elements that are making up the name of the genre. As you know, literary from Latin literarius, concerning reading and writing, and tale in Old Saxon meaning talk. So, literary fairy tales being by definition the author-centered products present a very interesting and very fruitful material for investigating the ways the authorial figure and his creative energy reveal in a story. So today I'm going to share with you my love for literary fairy tale and my interest for literary fairy tale, and particularly for one aspect which is most interesting for me, which is the visual images in literary fairy tale. And I hope you don't mind me using my notes, because I'm not a native speaker, right? So, and I would like to start with the quotation from Patricia Meyer-Sparks, who says that one can know the author in his work only through the study of his artifice. So today I will concentrate on three celebrated British authors whom I'm sure you know very well, maybe better than me, and whose versatile genius created to my mind, multidimensional texts with their peculiar visual language. So I'll start with the author, who is particularly special to you because he's connected and with the area where you live, and he spent a part of his life in this area, and I mean, of course, Kipling and his Just So stories. So as you know, Kipling's Just So stories belong to the subgenre of tales that explain in a fictional and very often playful way why something in the natural world is the way it is. So creation myths are a part of this genre. Kipling's collection of Just So stories intended for children is the best known example of this genre within literary tradition. So the cycle, as you know, contains 12 stories, and it was first published in 1902. And the early editions were illustrated by the author himself, who also gave commentaries to all his illustrations. So Kipling's discourse unfolds like a multidimensional game that incorporates the text with the author's unique wordplay and coinage, the visual image, his illustrations to the stories, the unobtrusive morals in the form of poems that conclude each story, the elements that make up the author as a stylistic unity. The author manifests himself by changing masks playfully, taking up various roles in his stories. He is a storyteller and an actor who, in the course of narration, acts out his characters. The acting is marked in text by Kipling's famous "so." He ate with his mouth, so. The crocodile winked his eye like this. So he is a partner in a game and an educator. He is an illustrator and a poet. And the creative energy of the author is also implemented in his original illustrations commented by himself. Both illustration and the commentaries are incorporated in the text of the tale and are called to manifest the author's presence in the text and his game discourse that he unfolds for his reader. The illustration turned Kipling's collection of stories into a book that plays to the reader, extending from non-reader to literate adult. Some of the illustrations, like the one to the beginning of Armadillos, openly invite the reader to start the game. So if you look at the illustration, I will read Kipling commentaries, you will understand what I'm talking about. So this is an inciting map of the turbid Amazon. It hasn't anything to do with the story, except that there are two armadillos in it up by the top. The inciting part are the adventures that happened to the men who went along the road marked by the double line. I meant to draw armadillos when I began the map, and I meant to draw manatees and spider-tailed monkeys and big snakes and lots of jaguars. But it was more inciting to do the map and the venturesome adventures. You begin at the bottom left-hand corner and follow the little arrows all about. And then you come quite round again to where the adventuresome people went home in a ship called the Royal Tiger. This is a most adventuresome picture, and all the adventures are told about in writing, so you can be quite sure which is an adventure and which is a tree or a boat. So these are his commentaries, and the commentaries reveal the skillful play of an intrusive author who re-enters and participates in the communicative context, involving his reader into playful myth creation and making the adventure of it. The next illustration is of different style, and this is the illustration to his story How the Camel Got His Hump, and you can see that it's a different style, and the illustration has a different purpose. And these are the commentaries that Kipling gives for this illustration. Here is the picture of the jinn in charge of all deserts, guiding the magic within his magic fan. The camel is eating of twig acacia, and he has just finished saying hum, once often too. The jinn told him he would, and so the hump is coming. The long towery thing growing out of the thing like an onion is the magic, and you can see the hump on his shoulder. The hump fits on the flat part of the camel's back. The camel is too busy looking at his own beautiful self in the pool of water to know what is going to happen to him. Underneath the truly picture of the world so new and old, there are two smoky volcanoes in it. Some are the mountains and some stones, and a lake and a black island, and a twisty river and a lot of other things, as well as a Noah's Ark. I couldn't draw all the deserts that the jinn was in charge of, so I only drew one, but it's a most deserty desert. So, as you can see, illustrations visually specify the text. They become an unalienable part of its composition, and also part of the author's discourse, the visual channel through which the author speaks to his reader. In other words, they present powerful means of highlighting the authorial presence. It's strange, though, that some later editions of some of Just So stories lack this important part of author's paratext. And in fact, the edition that I had was illustrated not by Kipling, but by a different illustrator. And this is really very strange, because his illustrations and commentaries, though very entertaining and playful on the surface, become a very useful source. I would say that they would become an ABC of world cultural heritage for a small child, because they include history, geography, ancient culture, studies, Bible. For example, the next illustration to how the leopard got his spots, you can see it's again a different style that he uses for his drawing. And here is Kipling's commentary for this illustration. This is wise Babian, a dog-headed baboon who is quite the wisest animal in all South Africa. I have drawn him from a statue that I made up out of my own head, and I have written his name on his belt and on his shoulder and on the thing he is sitting on. I have written it in what is not called Coptic and hieroglyphic and cuneiformic and Bengalic and Burmic and Hebric, all because he is so wise. He is not beautiful, but he is very wise, and I should like to paint him with paint box colors, but I am not allowed to. The umbrella-ish thing about his head is his conventional mane. So in his illustrations and comments, Kipling reveals himself not as a mentor for a child, but as a friendly guide who playfully educates his reader, turning his lessons into a funny game, which is not repeated from illustration to illustration. Another illustration to the same story presents a riddle, which is also very, very educative. And the commentary to this illustration would be, this is a picture of leopard and the Ethiopian after they had taken wise Babian's advice, and the leopard had gone into other spots, and the Ethiopian had changed his skin. So the Ethiopian was really a Negro, and so his name was Sambo. The leopard was called Spots, and he has been called Spots ever since. They are out hunting in the spiky, speckly forest, and they are looking for Mr. 123, where's your breakfast? If you look at a little, you will see Mr. 123 not far away. The Ethiopian has hidden behind a splotchy tree because it matches his skin, and the leopard is lying beside a spickly-spackly bank of stones because it matches his spots. Mr. 123 wears your breakfast is standing up eating leaves from a tall tree. This is really a puzzle picture like Find the Cat. So, and you are invited together with a child reader to spot the leopard who's just got the spots, to spot the Ethiopian who changed the color of his skin, and to spot their prey in the picture. So, and again, we see it's different kinds of style that he uses for his illustrations. So, the detailed analysis of Kipling's illustrations to the story, in fact, exposes various influences that shaped his style as an illustrator. In fact, the illustrations to Just So stories reveal a very eclectic Kipling. So Kipling works reveal the influence of Aubrey Birdsley and other artists of the 90s and after, whose style emphasizes the characteristic strengths of a photographic reproductive process that replaced the wood engraving of earlier Victorian illustrations. Other illustrations for other tales resemble the work of Sidney Syme, the Lord Dunsany's illustrator. The influence of Japanese prints appears in the composition of the Parsi beginning to eat his cake, an influence frequently found in the illustrations of his contemporary Heath Robinson. Kipling's page decoration for The Elephant Child resembles European and American folk motifs, and that of for How the Rhinoceros Got His Skin is an obvious borrowing from Navajo art. So as you can feel, this is not kids stuff, and as you can see, so there is a lot to investigate about Kipling as an illustrator, Kipling as a painter, and Kipling as an educator for his young reader. So both the text of the stories and the illustrations shed light on Kipling's cultural preferences that complement to his authorial image. The next author whose visual language I'd like to discuss with you is William Thackeray and his famous fairy tale, The Rose and the Ring. And for his illustration, I would like to, again, to quote Fisher, who said, "To read a Thackeray novel without its illustration is to miss the imp looking over your shoulder, holding a mirror to your own reading." So this is a very, very, very good understanding of how important are the illustrations of Thackeray to his works. So as you know, William Thackeray was primarily a writer, but originally aspired to be a painter and was also a respected critic of contemporary art. So he contributed satirical cartoons as well as writings to Punch and was an admirer of Cruikshank, an influence that is evident in his caricatures. And Thackeray's cartoons are comically grotesque and display the exaggeration. In 1854, Thackeray published this children's book, The Rose and the Ring, which is also called a fireside pantomime, which featured his own illustration. So the book is, has anybody read this, The Rose and the Ring? No, okay. So, which is a classic of British literature, you should know it. Okay. So the book is a fairy tale about kings and queens in an imaginary country, but also includes servants, footmen, black slaves, who are all visually stereotyped in accordance with the stereotypes of cartoons in Punch and other publications. So drawings of actual monarchs give indication of Thackeray's inspiration for his portrayal of royalty in the fairy tale, and The Rose and the Ring may be interpreted as a comment on the vanity and arrogance of the monarchy. But in fact, it's not that serious. It's really a very funny tale, and it's really a parody. So it's really an enjoyable reading, and I do recommend you read it if you haven't by this moment. So, in The Rose and the Ring, the relationships between the visual image and the text may be seen in a different way than in Kipling's Just So stories, because to my mind it may be seen as a dialogue, and the nature of this dialogue may be presented in the following way. Illustrations in his text add metaphoric commentary. They transgress the frames of narration. They fix the reader's attention to the most important places. They give visual characteristics to the heroes. In the fairy tale, illustration becomes an unalienable part of the author's intention and functions not as a decoration to his text, but they function as a key to his text that fixes the image and evokes interpretation beyond the ones that may be based on the verbal text only. So, as I've already said, The Rose and the Ring was illustrated by the author himself, and caricature style of Thackeray's illustrations offers the reader additional narrative voice, making the visual image as important as the text itself. So all the illustration in his The Rose and the Ring may be divided into two categories: sketches and caricature portraits of the main characters that perform different functions in the text. So the author defines the genre of his fairy tale as a fireside pantomime, which is seen as a spectacular show. So the sketches in his book help to establish mise-en-scenes of his show. The text is opened by the superlinear commentary. Here begins the pantomime, under which we see the first illustration, mise-en-scene. And there is, in the text, there is a sign under the illustration that is also a title for the first chapter. And the title for the first chapter is Shows How the Royal Family Sat Down to Breakfast. So looking at the illustration, will you guess that this is a royal family that sat down at breakfast? Not at all. And then the author gives a detailed description of the scene. So I will come back to the illustration, but first I will show the text that goes along with this illustration. This is Valoroso the 24th, the king of Paphlagonia, seated with his queen and only child at the royal breakfast table and receiving the letter which announces to his majesty a proposed visit from Prince Balbo, heir of Padella, reigning king of Tartary. Remark the delight upon the monarch's royal features. He is so absorbed in the perusal of the king of Tartary's letter that he allows his eggs to get cold and leaves his august muffins untasted. So, as you can see here in this small passage, I underlined all the words that highlight the royalty, the royal appearance, and the royal status of the people that are in the picture. But in fact, if we go back to the picture, we see that there is nothing royal at all about the way they look. First of all, what we see here, we see a very, very small table, which is not royal at all. We see three people who sit on the chairs of very different design, which shows their low income and low social status. You see very many eggs on the table, which is ridiculous to have so many eggs for breakfast. In other words, their image does not associate with the royal status that the author highlights in his text. And what we see is just a very, very ordinary middle-class family, ordinary in terms of income, in terms of intellect, in terms of appearance and manners. So what happens when we see one picture and when we read something that contradicts what we see in the text? So the author deliberately opposes the image to the text. He knocks together different levels, royal and ordinary, royal in the text and ordinary in his illustration. But at the same time, the author uses similar stylistic methods for his images, and his text, as the reader's attention switches from the text to the contrasting image. So the reader decodes different meanings simultaneously. Illustrations, as you know, usually complement the text. They visually describe the event. But in this case, the reader cannot turn to the illustration for confirmation of what he finds in the text. So the next illustration that follows immediately after this one are the portraits of the main characters, the king and the queen. And again, we can easily see that these are actually not the royal portrait, but the caricatures. But here the characters have all the necessary royal regalia, the crown, the scepter, the globe in the foreground. And note huge diamond on the top of the crown of the king. It's a common knowledge that a painter who draws the royal portrait should make it look as noble as possible, that the painter should actually conceal the natural shortcomings, right? But what we see here in this picture, these are caricatures. So the illustrator deliberately highlights physical faults of his characters. We see too long nose of the king, very plumpy forms of the queen, huge necklace that actually highlights the lack of the neck, then her empty, stupid eyes and the look on her face. So vice versa, instead of concealing their natural faults, he exaggerates them, making caricatures of the royal portraits. And what do we see in the text that follows and actually accompanies these illustrations? The author writes, King Valoroso's portrait has been left to us, and I think you will agree with me that he must have been sometimes rather tired of his velvet and his diamonds and his ermine and his grandeur. I shouldn't like to sit in that stifling robe with such a thing as that on my head. No doubt the queen must have been lovely in her youth, but though she grew rather stout in after life, yet her features, as shown in her portrait, are certainly pleasing. So, as you can see in this text, the author gives some words in italics. So, it's rather tired and certainly pleasing. So, the author signals the reader that he should give an ironic reading to the text and his portrait, though the text in this case seems to be rather neutral. Interestingly enough, that the author also denies the authorship of his illustrations by using passive constructions in the text. As you can see, portrait has been left to us, as shown in her portrait, as if it was not him who drew these illustrations, and it's not his fault that the characters are so ugly. So thus he gives the reader freedom to interpret the images confronting them to the text. Maybe it's just because he doesn't like the king and the queen. Maybe it's because these are negative characters, and that is why Thackeray treats them like that, making a parody of the characters. But, so the question arises, are there any protagonists in his fairy tale? There should be, protagonists, should be some positive characters. And let's see how the author treats his protagonists. And indeed, there is a princess and a prince in his story, Princess Betsinda, Orazalba, and Prince Gigler. Maybe he's not that sarcastic about them. Let's see. So, chapter 7 is called How Betsinda Fled and What Became of Her, and is introduced by the portrait of Betsinda at the palace gates, from which she was banished once. From the chapter we learn that poor Betsinda found shelter in the forest warden's hut, whose children recognized the princess in her by the shoe on her neck. The princess that was lost 15 years ago. And as you can see by the illustration is very intertextual, since on the one hand we can easily read the allusion to Cinderella. You can see the shoe that she carries. On the other hand, the portrait of the princess also is an ironic reminiscence to a typical portrayal of Madonnas, which can be read by numerous details. You can see her robe, her hair, her look, and the gesture. So on the one hand, she looks like a Madonna. On the other hand, by the shoe, we easily recognize a Cinderella. And the superlinear comment is, what a touching recognition, which is the second part of the comment to the whole chapter. To a heart she gains admission, what a touching recognition. So again, the author gives an ironic key to the reading of his illustration. And again, it's a parody on the protagonist. So the illustration of Prince Gigler is also penetrated with very subtle irony that enhances the parody style of narration. So the portrait of Prince Gigler is given for the episode when the prince gets horrible news that the king, Padella, is going to execute poor Rosalba. So anger and pain fills Prince's heart. He's a romantic hero, and his speech turns into a mixture of exclamations, rhetorical questions, quotations from famous playwrights, blank verse, and archives. So you can see the text that goes along the portrait. The brutal, ruthless, ruffian, royal wretch, as England's poesy has well remarked. The man that lays his hand upon a woman, save in the way of kindness, is a villain, ha hedzo. So he actually speaks in a blank verse. And in the illustration for this episode, you see a romantic hero in a theatrical pose, his chest decorated with huge orders and crosses, and in fact, there is no place for more orders and more crosses. He is heroic, too heroic for a prince. And he bends his head theatrically, and he wipes his tears with a huge handkerchief. So again, the parody style of the image is enhanced by the synthesis of the word, of the verbal expression of what we find in the text and what we see in the illustration. And again, the author uses similar means, similar stylistic means, both for the illustration and for his text. He uses hyperbole, he uses exaggeration, he uses them simultaneously to create both visually and verbally the parody portrait of his protagonist, and we get again the ironic reading of these main characters. I mentioned that the illustrations in Thackeray's The Rose and the Ring fall into two categories: the portraits of the main characters, and I also mentioned that there are sketches and mise-en-scène. So you saw one of them. And sketches also contribute to the general parody effect due to their carnivalesque style. So my favorite sketch in this book is this, where you can see the execution place and the notice, no admittance except on business. So as you can realize what type of business is that. So, and all these sketches that we find in Thackeray's The Rose and the Ring, they in fact create this parody effect, this ironic effect, and this ironic reading to the fairy tale, his parody to the romantic literature of his time. So illustrations of in Thackeray's text lead to a merger of two semiotic systems that complement each other. And you can see here we compare illustrations in Kipling's works and Thackeray's work. They perform different functions, they create different levels in this merger of verbal expression and visual image. So finally, I've come to a more complex case of text versus visual image relationship, when visual image is not incorporated into the texture, but exists, I would say, behind the text, being brought to the spotlight by the reader, who can decode allusions and reminiscences to paintings hidden in the text. And I would talk about the tale by Oscar Wilde, The Birthday of the Infanta. Are you familiar with that? Have you read it? I hope yes. Okay. So, as you know, I'm sure you know, Wilde's fairy tales are very peculiar in a sense that his style is influenced by and associated with the styles of painters and visual art in general. So in his Birthday of the Infanta, his background descriptions are associated with the paintings by Goya and Velázquez. It seems that Wilde follows the painters in his perception of space, color, and style, trying to find the verbal expression for them. It seems that the visual language of the painters become the source for his inspiration. Well, I should notice at this point that there are no explicit markers in the text that would directly allude to this or that paintings by Velázquez or Goya, but the reader can easily trace one peculiar feature of the tale's composition. The whole tale easily falls into a number of, let's call it, verbal pictures. It starts with the portrait of the Infanta, which you can see here, the portrait of the King Philip, then follow some sketches depicting the birthday performance, including the bullfight, the Muppet Show, Gypsy with a band, a monkey, the dance of the dwarf, the garden, and the palace interior descriptions just falls into these pictures. So technically speaking, this big part of the text is a pictorial exposition for a swift climax and a denouement or outcome, which is a tragic self-recognition of the dwarf in a mirror, his sudden death, and a cruel indifference of the Infanta. So Wilde's detailed, elaborate description reveal ekphrastic nature. By ekphrastic nature here I mean that ekphrasis is a genre in poetry and prose, and in fact it's a verbal representation of the visual image. So his verbal portrait of Infanta is in fact a detailed verbal representation of a famous Velázquez painting. He uses the same color scheme. Her dress is gray and pink, her hair golden, and her skin pale, just as in Velázquez portrait. So before I show this Velázquez picture, so I want you to look at the text. But the Infanta was the most graceful of all, and the most tastefully attired. Her robe was of grey satin, the skirt and the white puffed sleeve heavily embroidered with silver, and the stiff corset studded with rows of the pearls. 2 tiny slippers with the big pink rosettes peeped out beneath her dress as she walked. Pink and pearl was her great gauze fan, and in her hair, which like an aureole of faded gold stood out stiffy round her pale little face, she had a beautiful white rose. So, and here we have Diego Velázquez Infanta Margarita. So, as you can see, we may say that while creating the verbal portrait of his Infanta, Wilde almost quotes the painter. He uses the same color scheme, it's gray and pink. He uses the same, the same colors for portraying her hair, and we see the detail, the white rose in her hands. So, as we know, Velázquez was a court painter, and the court painter of King Philip, who is actually the father of the Infanta in the tale. And it seems that while Oscar Wilde draws the inspiration for his characters, setting from the pictures of Velázquez. So, if the portrait of the Infanta alludes to the actual portraits of Velázquez, then the image of the protagonist of the story, the dwarf, evokes associations with Goya's paintings. And in this case, the signals for the intertextual reading would be the key words that the author uses for the characteristic of his character. And I just picked out some of them, not all of them, but in all the descriptions everywhere where Wilde talks about the dwarf, he uses the same words and he repeats them insistently. And you will see what words are these. But the funniest part of all morning entertainment was undoubtedly the dancing of the little dwarf. When he stumbled into the arena, waddling on his crooked legs and wagging his huge misshapen head from side to side, the children went off into a loud shout of delight. The dwarf was really quite irresistible, and even in the Spanish court, always noted for its cultivated passion for the horrible, so fantastic a little monster had never been seen. Perhaps the most amusing thing about him was his complete unconsciousness of his own grotesque appearance. Indeed, he seemed quite happy and full of high spirits. It was a monster, the most grotesque monster that had ever been beheld, not properly shaped as all other people were. And again, when the truth dawned upon him, he gave a wild cry of despair and fell sobbing to the ground. So it was he who was misshapen and hunchbacked, foul to look at the grotesque. You see, he uses the same words, grotesque, exaggerated, misshapen. And these words become the key words that are associated, that perform reminiscent function, because they are associated with Goya's style, because Goya's etchings, the disparates, as you know, they also called grotesque, fantastic, and exaggerated. So, and this brings us to looking for the painting from Goya that would match the description of the dwarf in Wilde's tale. And we find, we find in his Disparates series, his last great series of etching depicting, as you know, the folly of mankind, that includes scenes of witchcraft and war, grotesque carnival festivities, and monstrously deformed creatures. We find this etching, which is called Babelicon, or sometimes is translated as a dancing fool or a silly idiot. And what we see here, again, we see that this is a misshapen creature, monstrous creature. But the light center of the painting here is his breast and his face. And we can see, though monstrous he is, but he is quite happy and quite unconscious of his monstrous appearance, just like the dwarf in Wilde's the Infanta Margarita, the Infanta tale. So we can see that in Wilde's tale he also seemed quite happy and full of high spirit. And what happens to him when he, while looking for the Infanta, runs through the palace and finally bumps into his own reflection in the mirror, realizes that he is ugly, and it was ugliness, his ugliness, that entertained the princess that much, and he realizes that, and he dies. And this is the climax of the story. And in connection with the climax of the fairy tale, it's fair to mention another very important allusion to a celebrated art of work in the text. And in his palace interior description, among other numerous details, Wilde mentions the artwork of Hans Holbein the Younger. Between the windows stood a black ebony cabinet, inlaid with plates of ivory, in which the figures from Holbein's Dance of Death had been graved by the hands of some said of that famous master himself. So this sentence, just quoted, finishes the detailed description of the throne room. The Dance of Death is given the role of a finale as the most impressive artwork. The artwork's name functions here as a key metaphor in the text then. So Dance of Death is a part of art collection which evokes admiration, aesthetic pleasure, and at the same time it becomes a symbol of the tragic end of the main hero. So the dwarf should dance again for the Infanta. He looks for her, running eagerly through the palace rooms. He bumps into his own mirror reflection. He realizes his ugliness, and being unable to accept the bitter truth, he dies. He will not perform his dance, his heart broken. His last dance turns into death fits that entertain the Infanta in her and her companions. So these are just the example from Holbein's Dance of Death. And when they saw the ugly little dwarf lying on the ground and beating the floor with his clenched hands in the most fantastic and exaggerated manner, they went off into shouts of happy laughter and stood all round him and watched him. He crawled like some wounded thing into the shadow and lay there mourning. His sobs grew fainter and fainter, and suddenly he gave a curious gasp and clutched his side. And then he fell back again and lay quite still. So this Dance of Death becomes a climax of the story. The allusion to the artwork functions as a key concept here. It helps the reader understand the author's message. Art and reality, even a fairy tale reality, contrast each other. The work of art, even if it reflects the ugliness of the reality, arouses admiration, but we admire the painter's craft, his style, his genius, his skill to find means to stir emotions to reach the desirable effect. Outside the art context, the event itself provokes different reaction. You can't accept the tragic end of the dwarf. You detest the cruel indifference of the Infanta. So, as you know, paradox of Wilde's fairy tales is that there are no happy ends to his stories. And I think that the interpretation which I suggested, based on the intermediate analysis, based on the analysis of the painting background context and its juxtaposition to his text, when we look for the links between different semiotic system, painting and the text in this case, I think it helps to understand the nature of Wilde's paradox. There are all the necessary attributes of a fairy tale: the princess, the king, the dwarf, talking flowers and animals, moral. But in Wilde's case, it's the pictorial style of the author that plays the role of the fairy tale source. So the writer follows the painter, trying to make his verbal expression as visual as possible. Each scene in a story is a picture, the portrait of a moment that is captured by his skillful hand. This special decorative style of Wilde is explained by his aesthetic beliefs, his, as you know, art for art's sake doctrine. According to Wilde, the art does not reflect the reality, but transforms it. It alone can make wonders, can stir imagination. For him, art is a true fairy tale, and that is why his fairy tale characters go through a reverse metamorphosis. They are personified portraits of real painters and appear in the reality where there is no place for wonder. And that is why his beautiful princess is a cruel, indifferent, spoiled child, and his dwarf is an unhappy monster, dying of his own ugliness. No fairy tale can compare with a wonderful masterpiece of a painter, in which the princess is always beautiful and the dwarf is forever happy. Thank you. So there is no, actual proofs in the critical literature for this kind of interpretation of the Wilde tales, but I hope that it was convincing enough. Thank you.
You have time for some questions.
Yeah, okay. All right.
I do have a question. I'm very interested in the idea of ekphrasis, and so I was fascinated that you brought that out in Wilde Tale. And I don't know if you've heard of Margaret Alexiou, the Greek or Greek-American critic. She talks about the use of ekphrasis in modern Greek fiction as a way of providing heightened moments and of significance, and in which there is this pictorial or synesthetic effect, and that the Greek writers use a more archaic or heightened register of language to do this, and that it's a little bit controversial because it's kind of anti-modern, because it involves the high language, and it also slows down the plot because time stops while you're doing the description. And I'm, as someone who works in writing in English and also teaching writing fiction to students, I'm interested in what possibilities there are today to use ekphrasis or some kind of ekphrastic technique, or whether it's impossible because we expect speed in the story. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I'm very keen on ekphrasis actually, because keen on these intermediate relations, the different variants of how the verbal text may be connected to this, visual forms of art. And I think this the Greek tradition that you mentioned, maybe they hold on to their ancient tradition, because ekphrasis actually started in ancient Greek, and the first example of ekphrasis is the description of Achilles' weapon, right? And it's really very lengthy and very high-flown style. But as for the modern forms of ekphrasis in poetry, it takes different forms, and usually it's not just the detailed description of what a poet or the writer sees, but takes the form of a dialogue, either with the painter or a dialogue with the work of art. Like in case, very famous ekphrasis is by Winston Hugh Auden, Musée des Beaux-Arts, where he mentioned this Fall of Icarus painting by Bruegel the eldest. And he does not describe the painting itself, but he uses it to think and to provoke the readers thinking about the measure of responsibility for, the fall of Icarus, whether it's tragic or not tragic, and whether how we perceive it. So I think ekphrasis in modern works, it does not slow the narration unless the author wants it to slow down. It's all up to the will of the author how to employ it, and it really takes different forms. So it's not just elaborate description, because elaborate description is a very, I would say, primitive form of ekphrasis. It dates back to the ancient tradition rather than to modern use of it.
Thank you.
Okay, more questions?
I have one.
Okay.
It's very interesting that what you've spoken about is the different forms that the author's dialogue with himself takes. But you've obviously chosen not to talk about the cases in which there's a famous artist illustrating another author's work.
Yeah.
And how different do you think that would be in some of the classics?
Yeah, I did it deliberately because I think that in case of, no matter how famous or celebrated the painter is who takes up, illustrating the author's work, it would be a different kind of a dialogue, because in this case it would be the interpretation of the text by a reader. So the illustrator, who is not the author, is in fact a reader who interprets the text by, using the visual language, right? In case when the author himself illustrates his work, it's a different, because he tries to combine different semiotic systems, the verbal expression and the visual expression, and it's his will how to conduct this dialogue. It's not the interpretation. It's it's his intent to try to make a synthesis of different kinds of work. That is why I think it's rather different. It would be not. It is a dialogue, but it's not intertextual or intermedial dialogue in this case. Well, I strongly believe in that. So it's just a different field of how the illustrators that are not the authors interpret the text. It's also interesting, but it's a different kind of dialogue. You had a question?
Thank you so much for your talk. Wonderfully rich, wonderful talk. I have a shallow question to ask about Thackeray and Rose in the Ring. I was fascinated as you were showing the images of the kind of resemblance between the illustrations and the royal family at that time. Prince Albert and Queen Victoria particularly, and at that age, I think 1851, bore a striking resemblance to those cartoons. I just wonder, knowing a little about Thackeray and his penchant for satire, do you think that was a deliberate strategy of a very ordinary middle-class royal family?
Yeah, I'm sure it was very deliberate on Thackeray's part, because he worked as a the character painter for Punch, for the journal, and of course his intention was to write a satire on the monarchy system of his time, and I'm sure that was quite deliberate on his part, not just a mere coincidence.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you for a most
all right.
illuminating
insightful talk. Thank you so much, Larisa. And we hope we'll see you back in Chichester
Thank
next
you.
year.
Yeah, thank you for having me here and sharing my love for the fairy tale.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.